Settle in. Pull your blanket close. Tonight, we travel back more than 3,000 years to a narrow river valley in the southern Peloponnese, where a civilization unlike any other in human history rose from the dust of conquest and forged itself, through fire and iron will, into the most feared military society the ancient world had ever known. This is the story of Sparta, of its shadowed origins, its brutal institutions, its extraordinary soldiers, its enigmatic women, its slow and inevitable decline, and the long echo it has cast across 25 centuries of human memory. Speak the name Sparta and the mind fills with images: warriors in scarlet cloaks, bronze-faced helmets, the narrow pass at Thermopylae, the whispered command to come back with your shield or on it. These images are not entirely wrong, but they are incomplete. Sparta was more than a barracks. It was a philosophy made flesh, a society that decided with cold deliberation to sacrifice everything that most civilizations call culture, comfort, and beauty in exchange for one thing above all others: military excellence. The result was a state that lasted for centuries, that defeated the great empire of Persia alongside its Greek allies, that humbled Athens in a generation-long war, and that produced soldiers whose reputation for courage still resonates in languages and literatures around the world. But Sparta was also a place of suffering, of children taken from their mothers, of helots, an entire enslaved people living under systematic terror, of a constitution so rigid it could not adapt, and of a population so carefully pruned that it eventually dwindled away. Sparta is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring to it. This documentary is your guide through every era of Spartan history, from the Bronze Age foundations to the Roman tourist destination it eventually became. We will move slowly, lingering where the story deserves to be savored, letting the night carry you gently through the centuries. There is no rush. Sparta itself believed that slowness and deliberation were virtues. So do we, tonight. Close your eyes when you are ready. The story begins. Chapter 1: The Land and Its First People. Before there were Spartans, there was a valley. The Eurotas River rises in the mountains of Arcadia to the north and flows southward through a broad, flat plain before emptying into the Laconian Gulf. The valley it carves is roughly 60 kilometers long and between 5 and 20 kilometers wide. On its western flank rise the Taygetos Mountains, a dramatic spine of gray limestone that reaches nearly 2,500 meters at its peak, snow-capped for months of the year, cut by deep ravines and forested with pine and oak. To the east, the gentler Parnon Range provides a softer wall. Between these two ranges, the valley sits like a cradle, fertile and well-watered, warmed by the Mediterranean sun, protected by geography from easy invasion. This land is called Laconia, and it has been inhabited since the Paleolithic period. Archaeologists have found evidence of human presence in the caves and rock shelters of the Taygetos foothills dating back tens of thousands of years. These early people left no records, only flint tools and the bones of the animals they hunted. They were not Spartans. They were not even Greeks in any meaningful cultural sense. They were simply people, doing what people do, surviving. By the Neolithic period, roughly 7 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, the valley supported settled agricultural communities. These people grew wheat and barley, raised goats and cattle, made pottery, and buried their dead in ways that suggest belief in an afterlife. They were connected by trade to other communities across the Aegean world. Obsidian from the island of Milos has been found at Neolithic sites in Laconia, evidence that even in these early millennia the valley was not isolated. Then came the Bronze Age, and with it, a transformation that would shape the deep character of the Laconian landscape for all time. Around 2000 BCE, new people began moving into Greece from the north. These were speakers of an early form of the Greek language, part of the vast Indo-European migrations that reshaped the human geography of Europe and Western Asia over several centuries. They brought with them bronze weapons, horses, and a social structure organized around warrior aristocracies. Wherever they went, they encountered existing populations, sometimes absorbing them, sometimes displacing them, always reshaping the cultural landscape. In Laconia, these newcomers gradually established dominance over the valley. They built hilltop strongholds, kept herds, and organized themselves into petty kingdoms. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, around 1600 to 1200 BCE, the area formed part of the wider Mycenaean civilization, that brilliant, violent, palace-centered culture that later Greeks would remember as the Age of Heroes. Mycenaean Laconia was centered not at the site of later Sparta, but at a place called Therapne, on a bluff above the east bank of the Eurotas, a few kilometers south of where classical Sparta would eventually stand. Here stood a palace complex, smaller than the great centers at Mycenae or Turin but still substantial, filled with frescoes, storage jars of oil and wine, administrative records written in Linear B, the earliest form of written Greek, and the apparatus of Mycenaean royal power. The Linear B tablets from Laconia, along with those from other Mycenaean sites, give us a fascinating glimpse into the economy and administration of this early Greek world. They record inventories of livestock, allocations of land, lists of offerings to gods, and the names of officials. Among the gods mentioned are figures we will recognize from classical Greek religion: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Artemis, and a figure called Poteinaya, the mistress, who may be an early form of Athena or a local goddess later absorbed into the Greek pantheon. What the tablets do not tell us is the political history, the names of kings, the stories of conquests, the texture of daily life. For that, we rely on archaeology, on the much later literary tradition, and on careful inference. The Mycenaean world knew Laconia as a significant kingdom. Homer's Iliad, composed perhaps 4 centuries after the Mycenaean period but preserving traditions much older, names the king of Sparta as Menelaus, brother of the great king Agamemnon of Mycenae. It is Menelaus whose wife, the famously beautiful Helen, is carried off by the Trojan prince Paris, triggering the great war that became the central story of Greek mythology and literature. Whether there was a historical Menelaus, a historical Helen, a historical Trojan War, these are questions scholars have debated for 2 centuries and will likely continue to debate. What is clear is that the Greeks of the classical period believed firmly in this heroic past, and the Spartans in particular drew enormous pride from their connection to it. Their city stood on the land of Menelaus. Their royal families claimed descent from the heroes. The past was not merely history to the Spartans. It was a source of identity and legitimacy. Around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, suddenly and catastrophically. Palaces burned across the Aegean world at Mycenae, at Turin, at Pylos, at Thebes, at Troy. Trade networks dissolved. Writing disappeared. Population levels fell sharply. The causes of this collapse remain one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Scholars have proposed climate change, drought, internal rebellions, earthquakes, disruptions of trade, and the movements of peoples known to the Egyptians as the Sea Peoples. Most likely some combination of these factors, feeding on each other in a cascade of disasters, brought down a civilization that had seemed immovable. In Laconia, the palace at Therapne was abandoned. The sophisticated administrative economy it had managed vanished. The population retreated into smaller, simpler communities. The 4 centuries that followed, roughly 1200 to 800 BCE, are known to historians as the Greek Dark Ages, a term that reflects both our ignorance of them and the apparent reduction in complexity and prosperity that characterized them. But the Dark Ages were not entirely dark. People continued to live in the Eurotas Valley. They continued to farm, to raise animals, to worship their gods, to bury their dead, to tell stories. The stories they told preserved memories distorted, mythologized, but real in their emotional core of the great civilization that had preceded them. And in the centuries of the Dark Ages, new forces were gathering that would eventually produce something entirely new. Chapter 2. The Coming of the Dorans. The Greeks of the classical period had a story to explain the transformation that followed the Bronze Age collapse. They called it the return of the Heraclidae, the return of the sons of Heracles. According to this tradition, the great hero Heracles had been cheated of his rightful kingdom in the Peloponnese. His descendants, the Heraclidae, had been driven into exile in northern Greece. Generations later, guided by an oracle from Delphi, they returned with an army of Dorians, a Greek tribal grouping from the northwest, to reclaim their inheritance. They conquered the Peloponnese, dividing it among themselves. The Eurotas Valley fell to the twin sons of one of the Heraclid leaders, and from them descended the dual royal families of historical Sparta. Modern scholars treat this story with considerable caution. The concept of a sudden, violent Dorian invasion replacing Mycenaean civilization has largely been abandoned. The archaeological evidence shows no clean break consistent with military conquest. Instead, there is a more complex picture of gradual population movements, local disruptions, and cultural change spread over generations. The Dorian dialects of Greek spoken in classical Laconia and other parts of the Peloponnese probably spread through a mixture of migration, elite replacement, and cultural diffusion rather than a single dramatic conquest. Nevertheless, something significant did happen in Laconia during the early Dark Ages. By the time the historical record becomes readable again, around 800 BCE, the population of the Eurotas Valley speaks a Dorian dialect and is organized into a settlement that will become Sparta. The people call themselves Lacedaemonians, Spartiati, or Spartans, is a term that applies specifically to the full citizen class. The traditional founding date of Sparta, according to ancient sources, is around 900 BCE, though this is almost certainly an artifact of later genealogical calculation rather than a historical fact. What we can say with more confidence is that by the 9th century BCE, a community of Greek-speaking Dorian settlers had established themselves in the Eurotas Valley and had begun to develop the distinctive institutions that would eventually make them famous. 4 small villages, Limni, Kynagera, Messoa, and Pitana, came together to form a single community. A 5th village, Amyclae, was incorporated somewhat later. This process of synoikism, or coming together, created the city-state that ancient and modern observers would call Sparta. Unlike most Greek city-states, which built their centers around a prominent rocky acropolis crowned with monumental temples and civic buildings, Sparta's settlement was remarkably modest. The villages remained distinct. There was no imposing central citadel in the early period. There were no great walls. The Spartans, in their later self-understanding, boasted that their men were their walls, a claim that would prove both accurate and, eventually, tragically insufficient. The Eurotas Valley offered the new community substantial resources. The land was fertile, capable of supporting a significant agricultural population. The surrounding mountains provided timber, game, and a degree of natural protection. The rivers could be harnessed for irrigation. There was no natural harbor nearby. The Laconian coast is not welcoming to ships, which meant that Sparta would never become a great maritime power, but also that it was somewhat insulated from the threats and opportunities of seafaring commerce. In the earliest period, Sparta was not dramatically different from other emerging Greek communities. It had aristocratic families who claimed descent from heroes, agricultural communities working the land, and a gradually developing political structure. It participated in the emerging Greek world of the early Archaic period, with its shared religious practices, its common athletic festivals, its developing literary tradition. Spartan artists of the 7th century BCE produced pottery, bronze figurines, and ivory carvings of genuine quality. Spartan poets wrote lyric verse celebrated across the Greek world. The Spartan festival of the Hyacinthia, honoring the young hero Hyacinthos and the god Apollo, was one of the most important religious occasions in the Peloponnese. None of this looks like a society that had already retreated into pure militarism. Something would change that. Something would turn this relatively normal Greek community into the militarized state that later ages would find so fascinating and so disturbing. That something was conquest and its consequences. Chapter 3: The Conquest of Messeniae. To the west of the Taygetos Mountains lay another fertile valley, the plain of Messenia, watered by the Pamizos River and its tributaries, richly productive, densely populated. The Messenians were Greeks, speaking a dialect similar to the Spartan Dorian, worshipping similar gods, organized into village communities and small kingdoms. They were prosperous, and Sparta wanted what they had. The First Messenian War, as ancient sources describe it, took place around 743 to 724 BCE, though modern scholars debate both the dates and the details. The Spartans, in need of more land to support a growing population, or driven by the ambitions of their aristocratic leaders, or both, invaded Messenia, and after a prolonged struggle conquered it. The Messenians were not simply defeated and left to live under Spartan rule as subject allies, as was common practice in Greek interstate relations. They were enslaved, not as individual household slaves, but as an entire community reduced to the status of helots. The word helot is one of the most debated in Greek scholarship. Its etymology is uncertain. Some ancient sources connect it to the town of Helos in Laconia, allegedly conquered by early Spartans. Others suggest it derives from a word meaning to be captured. Whatever the etymology, the institution it described was distinctive and brutal. Helots were state-owned agricultural serfs attached to specific plots of land. They could not be sold privately by individual Spartans. They belonged to the Spartan state, but they were compelled to farm the land allocated to Spartan citizens and to hand over a fixed portion of the harvest. They were not free to leave. They were subject to ritual humiliation and periodic massacre. They were, in the words of one ancient source, the slaves of the public. The helot system solved an economic problem for Sparta. It freed the citizen class from agricultural labor, allowing them to devote themselves to military training, but it created a social and psychological problem of enormous proportions. The helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens by ratios that ancient sources variously estimate at 5 to 1, 7 to 1, or even higher. They were a captive people with every reason to seek freedom and revenge. Managing the threat they represented would shape Spartan society at its deepest levels for centuries. For a generation or two after the First Messenian War, the helots of Messenia submitted to their new condition. They farmed the land, they paid their tribute, they nursed their resentments in private, and then, around 685 BCE, they rose. The Second Messenian War lasted approximately 17 years by ancient reckoning, and it came close to destroying Sparta. The Messenians, led by a legendary figure named Aristomenes, fought with desperate courage. Spartan losses were severe. At one point, ancient sources tell us, the Spartans were reduced to such desperation that they considered allowing illegitimate sons born to Spartan women during the war to become citizens, a measure that reveals how much the citizen population had suffered. The poet Tatius, writing during or shortly after this conflict, gives us some of our earliest direct evidence for Spartan values. His surviving poems are war songs, calling on young Spartan men to stand firm in the battle line, to hold their shields, to not flee, to die bravely if they must, but above all to hold. They speak to a community under enormous pressure, needing to be reminded of its courage and its duty. The fire in these poems tells us something important. The militarization of Sparta was not a comfortable achievement. It was forged in crisis. Sparta eventually suppressed the Second Messenian War. Aristomenes and many of his followers retreated to the mountain stronghold of Ira, where they held out for years before finally being defeated. The survivors of the Messenian resistance were scattered. Some fled to other parts of Greece, carrying their bitterness with them. those who remained became helots once more. But Sparta was changed by the experience. The near catastrophe of the Messenian revolts made clear to the Spartan leadership that the helot system, for all its economic benefits, carried a permanent existential threat. If the helots could coordinate a serious military uprising, especially if they received outside support, Sparta might not survive. The response to this threat would drive the transformation of Spartan society into something unprecedented. Chapter 4. The Great Reformation, the Lycurgan system. The Greeks attributed the institutions of Sparta to a single lawgiver, Lycurgus. Ancient sources describe him as a figure of the 9th or 8th century BCE, or, in some accounts, even earlier, who traveled widely, consulting the oracle at Delphi and studying the laws of other peoples, before returning to Sparta and establishing the constitution that would define the city for centuries. Modern historians are skeptical. Lycurgus may be a historical figure, a mythological one, or some composite of real reformers whose individual contributions were telescoped by later tradition into a single legendary personality. The Greeks themselves were uncertain. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, noted that there were competing traditions about who Lycurgus was and when he lived. Plutarch, writing 5 centuries after Herodotus, produced the most detailed surviving biography of Lycurgus, but by his own admission, he was working with contradictory and unreliable sources. What we can say with confidence is that the institutions associated with Lycurgus were real and distinctive, and that they appear to have taken shape gradually over the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, probably in response to the crisis of the Messenian Wars. Whether a single individual designed the system, or whether it evolved through a series of reforms under different leaders, the end result was a constitution, a way of organizing social and political life, that the Spartans themselves called the Great Retra, the Great Saying or Agreement. The Lycurgan system touched every aspect of Spartan life, from birth to death. Let us walk through its components one by one, as a night traveler might walk through the streets of a strange city, noting what is extraordinary. The Spartan state was governed by a complex, balanced constitution that ancient theorists found fascinating precisely because it combined elements of kingship, oligarchy, and democracy in a way that seemed to prevent any single element from dominating. At the apex were 2 kings, always from 2 separate royal families, the Agid and Eurypontid lines. The dual kingship was itself one of the distinctive features of Spartan government. Having 2 kings at once prevented royal tyranny, since each could check the other, but it also introduced inevitable tensions and rivalries that would sometimes paralyze decision-making. The kings were hereditary, passing their position from father to son. They held considerable prestige and certain important powers. They commanded the Spartan army in the field, they held prominent positions in religious ceremonies, and they sat on the Gerousia. But they were not absolute rulers. They could be prosecuted, fined, and even exiled by the other organs of government. Several Spartan kings were tried and condemned during the classical period, a reminder that the Spartan constitution, whatever its other features, was not a monarchy in the absolute sense. The Gerousia was the council of elders, 28 men over 60 years of age, elected for life by the citizen assembly, plus the 2 kings. The Gerousia functioned as both a deliberative body and a high court. It prepared legislation for the assembly, tried major criminal cases including the trial of kings, and exercised enormous influence over Spartan policy. The combination of lifetime tenure and advanced age gave the Gerousia a deeply conservative character. These were men too old to die in battle, but too powerful to ignore, and they had every incentive to preserve the institutions that had given them status. The Apella, or citizen assembly, consisted of all male Spartan citizens who had passed through the full military training and had been accepted into a mess group. The Apella met monthly, voted on major decisions of war and peace, and elected the members of the Gerousia and the Ephors. Its voting method was distinctive and, to modern eyes, rather charming. Instead of counting hands or tokens, the assembly voted by shouting, and officials judged which side had shouted louder. This method was famously subject to manipulation, since the officials making the judgment could interpret the volume to suit their preferences. The Ephors, 5 men elected annually by the assembly, were in some ways the most powerful magistrates in Sparta, despite having no hereditary claim to their position. The Ephors supervised the kings, accompanied them on campaign, and could arrest and try them. They managed the state's relations with the Helots, overseeing the Crypteia and the annual declaration of war against the Helots that gave legal cover to the practice of killing them. They received foreign ambassadors, conducted negotiations, and managed much of the day-to-day administration of the state. The Ephoracy was a genuinely democratic institution in one sense. Any Spartan citizen could serve as an Ephor, but its enormous power made it a target of reformers who thought it had grown too strong. This constitutional structure, dual kings, council of elders, citizen assembly, 5 Ephors, was the political framework within which the Lycurgan social system operated. And it was that social system that made Sparta truly unique. Chapter 5. The Agioge Education in Iron. Every male child born to a Spartan citizen was, in theory, subject from the moment of birth to the scrutiny of the state. Ancient sources, primarily Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, written in the 1st century CE but drawing on earlier material, describe a process by which newborn Spartan boys were examined by elders of the tribe. Infants judged healthy and well-formed were assigned a plot of public land to support them and their future families. Infants judged sickly, deformed, or simply unpromising were exposed, left on a rocky cleft of the Tegidos, or at a designated place called the apotheti, the place of rejection. The infant would die of exposure and starvation unless it happened to be found and rescued by someone, which was not impossible but not expected. Modern scholars debate how consistently this practice was actually followed. The Spartans may have been somewhat less systematic about it than Plutarch implies. Ancient literary sources tend to amplify Spartan exceptionalism for rhetorical effect. But the principle was real. Sparta considered the production of healthy soldiers a state interest, and it was willing to make brutal decisions in service of that interest. If he survived infancy, the Spartan boy lived with his family until the age of 7. Then the state took him. At 7, boys were enrolled in the agoge, the upbringing, the training system. They were organized into herds called agli, under the supervision of older boys and adult overseers. They left their families' homes and began living communally, sleeping on beds of rushes they had gathered themselves from the banks of the Eurotas, wearing a single garment for the entire year regardless of weather, going barefoot to toughen their feet, eating in common messes on food carefully calibrated to leave them slightly hungry. Because, the Spartans believed, hunger made boys resourceful, light-footed, and accustomed to hardship. The agoge had multiple, intertwined purposes. It was a physical training program, hardening the bodies of future soldiers. It was a character formation program, instilling endurance, obedience, and collective loyalty. It was a socialization program, creating bonds of comradeship among age cohorts that would bind men together on the battlefield. And it was a selective program, continuously weeding out those who could not meet its standards. The curriculum of the agoge was heavy on physical training, running, wrestling, throwing, swimming, and light on what we would call academic education. Spartans were expected to read and write, but literacy was a functional skill, not cultivated for its own sake. Music and choral singing were important, partly for their military applications in maintaining formation rhythms during battle, and partly for the discipline they imposed. Mathematics and philosophy were not emphasized. The Spartans were famous in the ancient world for their brevity of speech. The word laconic, meaning a short, pointed expression, derives from the Greek name for Laconia, and this verbal economy was itself a product of the agoge, which discouraged long speeches and rewarded pointed, direct expression. Boys in the agoge were deliberately encouraged to steal food as a training in stealth and cunning. But if they were caught, they were punished not for the stealing, but for being caught. The story most often cited to illustrate this principle involves a boy who had stolen a fox and hidden it under his cloak. When challenged by an adult, he denied having it and maintained his denial even as the fox, panicking, chewed through his abdomen. The boy died without admitting the theft. Whether this story is literally true is beside the point. It was told as an illustration of Spartan values: endurance of pain, loyalty to one's story, the shame of being caught. At 18, youths in the agoge entered a particularly intense and dangerous phase of their training. They were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies, expected to survive by their own resources, which in practice meant raiding the helot population. This period was called the crypteia, the secret thing, or the hiding. Young men operating in the crypteia lived rough, traveled at night, and were encouraged to kill helots, particularly any who seemed strong, capable of leadership, or otherwise threatening. The crypteia was simultaneously a training exercise in stealth and survival, and a mechanism of social control, eliminating the most capable helots before they could become leaders of rebellion. The crypteia is one of the most disturbing elements of the Spartan system, and ancient sources disagree about its nature and extent. Plutarch attributes it directly to Lycurgus and describes it in stark terms. Some modern scholars have questioned whether it was as systematic as he describes, but the underlying practice, state-sanctioned killing of helots, is attested in multiple sources and fits the logic of the Spartan system too well to be dismissed. At 20, the Spartan man completed the formal agoge and was eligible to be elected to a mess group, a sicyon. Membership in a mess was essential. Without it, a man could not be a full Spartan citizen, regardless of his birth. The election process was deliberately opaque. Each member of the mess had to vote for any new candidate, and a single negative vote was sufficient to exclude him. A rejected man lost his citizen rights. This made the mess system both a mechanism of social bonding. Men who ate together for 30 years were deeply committed to each other, and a powerful tool of social conformity, since anyone who deviated too far from Spartan norms risked rejection. Spartan men continued to live primarily in their mess groups and barracks until the age of 30, even if they were married. Only at 30 could a man formally live with his wife and children and participate fully in the citizen assembly. The transition from barracks to household was gradual and never complete. The messes continued to meet for daily meals throughout a man's active life, and the bonds of the mess group remained central to Spartan male identity. Chapter 6: The Spartan Woman. Nowhere in the ancient Greek world were women more talked about, more admired, more feared, and more misunderstood than in Sparta. In Athens, the city that produced most of the written records that survive from classical Greece, respectable women were expected to remain indoors, to manage the household, to avoid contact with men outside their family, and to be, in the famous phrase attributed to Pericles, as little spoken of as possible, whether in praise or blame. Spartan women were, by these Athenian standards, almost shocking. Spartan girls underwent their own version of physical training, though whether this was as formalized and compulsory as the male agoge is debated. They ran, wrestled, threw the discus and javelin, and competed in athletic festivals. They were expected to be physically strong. The Lycurgan rationale, as ancient sources explain it, was that strong mothers produced strong children, and strong children made better soldiers. The physical culture of Spartan women was thus instrumental, in service of the state's military needs, but its effects went far beyond that narrow purpose. Spartan women ate better than their counterparts in other Greek cities. They were not kept on the restricted diets considered appropriate for respectable women elsewhere. They were expected to consume enough to maintain their physical conditioning. They lived in a social environment where physical achievement was respected, where weakness was not an acceptable feminine virtue. The relative freedom and strength of Spartan women struck other Greeks as both admirable and vaguely threatening. Aristotle, who generally disapproved of Sparta, complained that Spartan women were too free, too powerful, too undisciplined, that they had effectively captured their husbands, who spent so much time in military training and mess halls that their wives ran the households and accumulated property. There is truth in this observation. Spartan women did manage family property, negotiate economic arrangements, and exercise social influence in ways unusual for the ancient Greek world. Spartan women were also known for their sharp speech, for saying exactly what they thought, without the deference expected of women elsewhere. A collection of sayings attributed to Spartan women survived into antiquity and was preserved by Plutarch. These sayings have a consistent character: pride in Spartan values, contempt for cowardice, willingness to sacrifice sons and husbands for the city's glory. A mother who learns her son died in battle asks how he died. If he died bravely, she is satisfied. If he died in flight, she is shamed. A woman handing her son his shield tells him to come back with it or on it. Another, told that all 5 of her sons have been killed in battle, asks only whether Sparta was victorious, and hearing that it was, says the news is good. These stories are probably apocryphal or at least heavily polished by the tradition. They represent an ideal of Spartan womanhood rather than a sociological survey, but ideals are revealing. The Spartan ideal of femininity was built around the same values as the ideal of masculinity: endurance, pride, commitment to the community, contempt for weakness, and self-pity. This consistency is itself remarkable. Marriage customs in Sparta were also distinctive. Girls married later than in other Greek cities, perhaps in their late teens rather than the early teens common elsewhere. The marriage ceremony, as described by ancient sources, involved a curious ritual. The bride had her head shaved and was dressed in men's clothing. Then her new husband visited her secretly at night, returned to his barracks before dawn, and continued to live with his mess group. This arrangement of nocturnal conjugal visits and public separation continued for some time, perhaps until the man turned 30. The rationale offered by ancient sources was that the secrecy and anticipation strengthened desire and improved the chances of conception, and that the physical separation kept both parties in peak condition. Property and inheritance laws in Sparta gave women unusual economic power. Spartan women could own land, inherit property, and manage estates. By the 4th century BCE, ancient sources suggest that Spartan women owned perhaps 2/5 of the land in Laconia, a consequence partly of inheritance patterns and partly of the high casualty rate among Spartan men, who frequently died in battle without male heirs. This concentration of property in female hands was cited by Aristotle as a major source of Sparta's later weakness. When the citizen population declined, much of the wealth had ended up in the hands of women who were not full citizens, and whose property could not easily be redistributed to support new soldiers. Chapter 7: Iron Money and the Economy of Virtue. One of the most striking features of the Lycurgan system, as ancient sources describe it, was the prohibition of gold and silver currency in Sparta. Instead, the Spartans used iron bars, heavy, awkward, deliberately useless for anything beyond the Laconian border, as their medium of exchange. The stated purpose was to discourage greed and the accumulation of private wealth, to prevent the corrupting influence of money from entering Spartan society. In practice, of course, wealthy Spartan families found ways around this prohibition. They kept gold and silver in foreign banks, received gifts from allied states, accumulated land and livestock. The prohibition on precious metal currency did not eliminate wealth inequality, it simply drove it underground. But it did serve an important ideological function. It marked Sparta as a place where the normal rules of the Greek economic world did not apply, where the citizen was defined not by his wealth but by his virtue and his military service. Spartan citizens were forbidden, at least in theory, from engaging in commerce or craft production. These activities were left to two intermediate categories of the Spartan social world, the Perioeci, who were free non-citizen Greeks living in the towns and villages of Laconia surrounding the Spartan citizen villages, and the Helots, who produced the agricultural surplus that sustained the citizen class. The Perioeci, literally those who dwell around, are one of the least understood elements of the Spartan system. They were free people, many of them descended from pre-Dorian populations of Laconia or from communities that had submitted voluntarily to Spartan authority, who lived under Spartan hegemony without being Spartan citizens. They paid no tribute in the normal sense, but they were expected to serve in the Spartan army when called and to provide economic services, craftsmanship, commerce, some forms of manufacturing, that the citizen class disdained. They had no voice in Spartan political decisions, but they had their own local autonomy in their communities. The Perioeci produced the bronze work, the weapons, the pottery, and other goods that the Spartan state needed. It was Perioeci craftsmen who made the famous Laconian bronze, who manufactured the shields and helmets that Spartan soldiers carried into battle. The citizen class fought. The Perioeci made the tools of fighting. The Helots, as we have seen, produced the food. Each Spartan citizen was allocated a plot of land, called a kleros, which was farmed by Helot labor. The Helots were required to deliver a fixed portion of the harvest to their Spartan master. Ancient sources suggest about half, though the exact proportion is uncertain. What they retained beyond this payment was theirs to use or sell. They could accumulate some property, maintain family units, and conduct their own religious and cultural lives within the severe constraints of their condition. The Helot population maintained its own identity, particularly in Messenia, where the memory of freedom was never entirely extinguished. Messenian Helots spoke their own dialect of Greek, maintained their own traditions, and crucially, maintained a shared identity as a conquered people with a grievance. This collective identity made them persistently dangerous. Unlike individual slaves who had been torn from different cultures and could not easily coordinate, the Messenian Helots were a community. Sparta managed this danger through a combination of terror and ritual humiliation. The annual declaration of war against the Helots placed any killing of Helots outside the normal religious constraints on shedding Greek blood. The Crypteia hunted down the most capable Helots. The Crypteia was accompanied by more mundane forms of humiliation. Helots were required, by some accounts, to wear dogskin caps and carry a fixed number of whippings each year regardless of conduct, to mark them out and remind them of their status. And yet Helots served in Spartan armies, sometimes in significant numbers. They served as light infantry, as baggage carriers, as personal attendants to citizen soldiers in the field. When Sparta was desperate enough, as in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, Helots were offered freedom in exchange for military service. These freed Helots, called neodamodes, served as soldiers in Sparta's increasingly manpower-stretched forces in the later 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The relationship between Sparta and its Helots was thus not simply one of brutal domination. It was a complex, evolving, deeply unstable relationship that Sparta was always managing and never quite resolved. Chapter 8: Sparta in the Archaic Greek World. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, Sparta had transformed itself from one ambitious Greek city-state among many into the dominant land power of the Greek peninsula. The path to this dominance ran partly through military conquest and partly through diplomacy of a subtler kind. After the settlement of the Messenian question through the suppression of the Second Messenian War, Sparta turned its attention to the rest of the Peloponnese. The strategy it employed was not always direct conquest. Sparta preferred, where possible, to establish treaties of alliance that bound other states to Spartan leadership, without requiring the enormous effort of full-scale conquest and occupation. These arrangements eventually solidified into the Peloponnesian League. a network of alliances centered on Sparta that encompassed most of the city-states of the Peloponnese and some beyond. The Peloponnesian League was not an empire in the sense of direct territorial control. Member states maintained their own internal governments and their own legal systems. What they surrendered was independent foreign policy. They were bound to follow Sparta in war and to provide troops for Spartan-led campaigns. In exchange, Sparta protected them from external threats and, crucially, from internal revolution. The Spartans were deeply hostile to political change, particularly to tyranny and to democracy in its more radical forms. States allied with Sparta could generally rely on Spartan intervention if their aristocratic governments were threatened by popular uprisings. This conservatism was itself a form of power. Greek politics in the Archaic period was convulsed by the struggle between aristocratic factions and popular leaders, tyrants and democrats, who sought to mobilize the common people against the established noble families. Sparta consistently supported the aristocratic side of these struggles, offering the threat of military intervention as a deterrent against radical political change. States that might otherwise have supported ambitious reformers had reason to hesitate when Sparta's soldiers were a march away. At the same time, Sparta had its own encounters with tyranny and reform. The Spartan constitution itself underwent significant development in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. The institution of the ephorate, the 5 annually elected magistrates, appears to have been strengthened in this period, possibly as a way to check the power of the kings. The relationship between the constitutional organs of Sparta evolved over time, and the Sparta of 550 BCE was not identical to the Sparta of 700 BCE. Spartan foreign policy in the 6th century included several notable episodes. The Spartans defeated Argos, their longtime rival in the eastern Peloponnese, in the Battle of the Champions around 546 BCE, a remarkable contest in which, according to ancient tradition, 300 men from each side fought to decide the fate of a disputed territory, leaving at the end only 2 Argives and 1 Spartan alive. Both sides claimed victory, the Argives because they had 2 survivors to Sparta's 1, the Sparta because its sole survivor had remained on the field while the Argives retreated to report their victory. A subsequent full-scale battle settled the question in Sparta's favor. In the same period, the Spartans expelled the tyrants of Corinth and of other Peloponnesian cities, establishing a pattern of intervention in favor of oligarchic stability. They also formed an alliance with Croesus of Lydia, the fabulously wealthy king whose name became a byword for riches, though this alliance was rendered moot when Croesus was defeated by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. The rise of Persia in the east was the event that would eventually force Sparta to play a role on a much larger stage than the Peloponnese. But for now, in the comfortable middle of the 6th century BCE, Sparta was content to be the greatest power in mainland Greece, the guarantor of Peloponnesian order, the model of military virtue that other Greeks admired, envied, and increasingly tried to imitate or at least to cite. Chapter 9. The Persian Wars Marathon, Thermopylae, and Plataea. In 490 BCE, a Persian army crossed the Aegean and landed on the plain of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Persians had come in response to Athenian and Eretrian support for a revolt of the Greek cities of Ionia, the western coast of Asia Minor, against Persian rule. The revolt had failed, but the Persian king Darius had not forgotten or forgiven. His generals landed on Greek soil with an army that the Greeks estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Modern scholars suggest something more like 20 to 30,000, still a very substantial force. Athens appealed to Sparta for help. A Spartan runner named Phidippides, the same man whose name is associated with the famous run to Athens after the battle, covered the roughly 240 kilometers between Athens and Sparta in 2 days, an extraordinary feat of endurance. The Spartans were sympathetic, but they were in the middle of a religious festival during which Spartan religious law prohibited military action. They promised to come as soon as the festival was over. They came too late. The Athenians, together with a small contingent from Plataea, fought the Battle of Marathon without them, and won, one of the most surprising military victories of the ancient world, with significantly outnumbered Greek infantry routing the Persian force and sending it back across the sea. Sparta arrived after the battle and was shown the Persian dead. The historians record that they said the Athenians had done well and went home. This reaction, admirably brief, impossible to read, captures something essential about the Spartan character, an absolute refusal to express more than the situation strictly required. The Second Persian invasion came 10 years later, in 480 BCE. This time the scale was incomparably larger. The Persian king Xerxes, Darius's son and successor, assembled what ancient sources describe as the largest army ever gathered, millions of men, hundreds of ships. Modern estimates are again much more modest, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 land troops, with a fleet of perhaps 600 to 800 warships. But even these revised figures represented an overwhelming force by Greek standards. The Greeks, under threat of extinction as independent city-states, did something unprecedented. They cooperated. A Hellenic League was formed, drawing together states that were normally rivals and occasional enemies, bound by the common threat of Persian conquest. Sparta, as the leading military power of Greece, was given command of the allied land forces. Athens, which had built a formidable fleet with revenue from its silver mines at Laurion, commanded the allied navy. The two greatest Greek powers, different in almost every respect, formed an uneasy alliance of survival. Xerxes' army entered Greece from the north, marching through Macedon and Thessaly, which submitted without resistance. The Greek alliance needed time for the fleet to fight, time for the seasons to change, time for the Persian logistical chain to strain. They chose to make their stand at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, where the mountains came so close to the sea that only a few men could pass abreast. Leonidas, king of the Agid line at Sparta, led the Greek land force. He brought 300 Spartan citizens, a number selected, ancient sources tell us, for having living sons who could carry on their family lines, since Leonidas expected not to survive. With him came contingents from other Greek states: Thespians, Phocians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians. The total allied force numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men. For 2 days, this force held the pass against the full weight of the Persian army. The Persian infantry, including the elite corps called the Immortals, threw themselves against the narrow front and were repulsed with catastrophic losses. The Greeks fought in tight formation, their long spears and interlocking shields creating a wall that the more lightly armed Persians could not easily penetrate. Leonidas rotated his forces, allowing fresh troops to relieve the exhausted, maintaining pressure and coherence. On the third day, a local man named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks, showing the Persians a mountain path that bypassed the pass and allowed them to attack the Greek position from the rear. Leonidas, learning of the encirclement, dismissed most of the allied contingents, keeping only the 300 Spartans, the Thespians who refused to retreat, and the Theban contingent which had little choice. They fought to the last man. The body of Leonidas was found and mutilated by Persian orders, an indication of how much damage the small Greek force had done to Persian pride and Persian bodies. A stone lion was later erected over the Spartan dead, with an inscription that became one of the most famous epitaphs in Western literature. "Stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here, obedient to their words." Thermopylae was a military defeat, but a moral victory of incalculable value. The story of the 300 spread through Greece and beyond, becoming a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds, of the possibility of resistance even in the face of certain death. The Persians went on to capture and burn Athens, whose population had evacuated. But the naval battle of Salamis, fought shortly after Thermopylae, shattered the Persian fleet and left Xerxes' massive land army in an impossible logistical position. In 479 BCE, the decisive land battle was fought at Plataea in Boeotia. A Greek allied army, again with Sparta providing the core of the fighting force and Spartan general Pausanias in overall command, engaged the remaining Persian army under its general Mardonius. The battle was hard fought, and at moments went badly for the Greeks, but in the end the Persian force was destroyed, Mardonius was killed, and the Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. The Persian wars had confirmed what the Greeks already suspected, that Spartan soldiers, fighting in formation, were the finest infantry in the world. The reputation forged at Thermopylae and Plataea would sustain Sparta's prestige for generations. But the wars also revealed fault lines. In particular, the growing rivalry between Sparta and Athens, which had proved its own military worth at Marathon and Salamis, and was now beginning to think about what its future might look like in a Greece no longer threatened by Persia. Chapter 10. The Age of Rivalry, Sparta and Athens. The half-century between the Persian Wars and the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE is sometimes called the Pentacontia, the 50 years. It was a period of remarkable Athenian growth and of growing Spartan anxiety. Athens emerged from the Persian Wars with enormous prestige, a rebuilt fleet, and an increasingly democratic political system under leaders like Themistocles and later Pericles. The Athenians took the lead in the continuing struggle against Persia, organizing the Delian League, an alliance of Aegean and Ionian Greek states that eventually became an Athenian empire in all but name. Allied states that had originally contributed ships to the common cause were gradually converted into tribute-paying subjects. The money flowed into Athens, funding the construction of the Parthenon and the other magnificent buildings of the Acropolis, supporting the most vibrant intellectual and artistic culture in the Greek world, and maintaining the largest navy in the Aegean. Sparta watched this growth with increasing unease. The Athenian Empire was exactly the kind of single-power dominance that Sparta had spent the 6th century preventing. The Athenians, moreover, were not content to limit their activities to the Aegean. They began meddling in the affairs of Corinth and other Peloponnesian states. They rebuilt their city walls, making Athens defensible against land attack. They extended democracy and built institutions that challenged the conservative oligarchic model that Sparta preferred. The tension between the two cities erupted into open but limited conflict in the 460s and 450s BCE. Athens intervened in a conflict between Corinth and Megara. Sparta faced a major Helot revolt following a catastrophic earthquake in 464 BCE, one of the most dangerous crises in Spartan history, which saw the Helots establish a fortified position on Mount Ithome in Messenia and hold out for years before finally negotiating terms. During this revolt, Athens initially sent help, but the Spartans, distrustful of the Athenians and their democratic ideas, sent them away, a profound insult that accelerated the breakdown of relations. A period of intermittent conflict in the 450s and 440s, sometimes called the First Peloponnesian War, ended in the 30 Years' Peace of 446 BCE, which attempted to divide the Greek world into Spartan and Athenian spheres of influence. It lasted 15 years. In 431 BCE, Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies launched a full invasion of Attica, the territory of Athens. The Peloponnesian War had begun. The war that followed lasted 27 years, devastated the Greek world, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and ended with Athens' defeat and a brief but brutal period of Spartan hegemony. It is one of the most extensively documented conflicts of the ancient world, thanks primarily to Thucydides of Athens, who was both a participant and the most rigorous historian of his age. The strategic logic of the war was asymmetric. Sparta had the finest land army in Greece. Athens had the finest navy. Sparta could invade and ravage Attica but could not storm Athens' walls. Athens could use its navy to maintain trade routes and conduct raids on the Peloponnesian coast, but could not easily destroy Sparta's land forces. The two sides were, for much of the war, unable to deliver decisive blows to each other. Pericles, Athens' dominant statesman, adopted a strategy of defensive patience. Avoid pitched land battles with the superior Spartan infantry, maintain the fleet and the empire. Use the Athenian financial reserves to outlast Sparta. The strategy was sound, but it required iron nerves. Watching from the city walls as Spartan soldiers burned Attic farms and orchards, Athenian citizens found patience almost impossible to maintain. In 430 BCE, a catastrophic plague struck Athens. It swept through the overcrowded city, packed with refugees from the Spartan invasions, and killed perhaps a quarter or more of the population over several years. Pericles himself died in the plague in 429 BCE. The Athenian war effort continued without its architect, and without his restraining influence, the Athenians began making increasingly reckless decisions. The war ground on through alternating periods of intense fighting and exhausted truces. The Peace of Nisches in 421 BCE halted the main conflict, but the peace was fragile and incomplete, with various allies of both sides continuing to fight. Athens, in a moment of extraordinary hubris, decided in 415 BCE to launch a massive expedition against Syracuse in Sicily, ostensibly to help allies, really to extend Athenian power into the western Mediterranean and cut off Sparta's grain supplies. The expedition ended in complete catastrophe in 413 BCE, with the destruction of the entire Athenian force, 45,000 men or more killed, captured, or enslaved. It was one of the greatest military disasters of the ancient world. Sparta, energized by the Athenian disaster, and now receiving financial support from Persia in exchange for abandoning the Ionian Greeks to Persian control, pressed its advantage. The Persians funded the construction of a Spartan fleet, paradoxical for the land-focused Lacedaemonians but militarily necessary. The Spartan admiral Lysander proved a naval commander of genius, outmaneuvering Athenian fleets and cutting the grain supply lines from the Black Sea. Athens, starving and with its fleet destroyed, surrendered in 404 BCE. The victors imposed harsh terms. The long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus were torn down. The Athenian fleet was reduced to 12 ships. The democracy was briefly replaced by an oligarchic regime backed by Spartan power, the 30 tyrants, whose brutal rule lasted only about a year before the Athenians overthrew it and restored democracy. Sparta, to its credit, did not attempt to destroy Athens or enslave its population, as some of its allies had demanded. The Peloponnesian War left Sparta the undisputed hegemon of the Greek world. It was a position Sparta was profoundly ill-equipped to manage. Chapter 11: The Spartan Hegemony and Its Contradictions. Hegemony, leadership, dominance, the power to set the terms for others, requires skills that Sparta had never cultivated. It requires diplomatic subtlety, economic management, an understanding of diverse peoples and places, the ability to project power through institutions rather than just armies. Sparta had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of maintaining a static, controlled social order at home. It had almost no experience administering an empire. The Spartan hegemony of the early 4th century BCE was characterized by arrogance, inconsistency, and a series of policy choices that alienated virtually every Greek state that had once supported or at least tolerated Spartan power. Spartan commanders abroad harmost, they were called. Garrison commanders became notorious for greed, arbitrary rule, and corruption. The very qualities that the agoge was supposed to eliminate, love of money, personal ambition, abuse of power, flourished when Spartan men operated far from the social pressures of the home community. Spartan foreign policy managed the remarkable feat of turning almost everyone against them. The Boeotians, led by Thebes, resisted Spartan domination. Corinth, an old ally, became hostile. Athens recovered enough to challenge Spartan naval supremacy. Persia, which had backed Sparta against Athens, now found it convenient to support Athens against Sparta. In 395 BCE, the Corinthian War began, a coalition of Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Thebes, backed by Persian gold, fighting against Sparta. The war ended in 387 BCE with the King's Peace, a settlement dictated by the Persian king Artaxerxes II that effectively returned the Ionian Greek cities to Persian control. The Spartans accepted this because it gave them Persian backing for their dominance of mainland Greece. Every other Greek state was humiliated by it. The episode stripped away any remaining Spartan claim to be defenders of Greek freedom against Persia. The death blow to Spartan hegemony came from an unexpected direction. The Boeotians, and specifically from the city of Thebes, and more specifically still from two remarkable men named Epaminondas and Pelopidas. Epaminondas was a military genius of the first order, innovative, deeply educated in philosophy and mathematics, personally courageous, and strategically visionary. Pelopidas led the sacred band of Thebes, an elite force of 150 pairs of lovers fighting side by side. The theory being that men would fight more courageously and die rather than show cowardice before their beloved companions. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Epaminondas shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. He employed a revolutionary tactical formation, concentrating his best troops on the left wing in a deep formation of 50 shields, while refusing his weaker right wing. The Spartan force, expecting to overwhelm the Greek left as always, found itself instead overwhelmed by the massed Theban weight. The Spartan right wing, where the elite Spartan citizens fought, was crushed. Nearly 400 Spartan citizens were killed in a single afternoon, a catastrophic loss for a community whose citizen body had already shrunk alarmingly. The number is worth pausing over. Spartan citizens, full Spartiate warriors who had passed through the Agoge and maintained their mess membership, may have numbered around 8,000 to 10,000 in the early 5th century. By 371 BCE, after 2 centuries of warfare and declining birth rates, they numbered perhaps around 2,000, possibly fewer. The loss of 400 in a single battle was not merely a military defeat, it was a demographic catastrophe. Epaminondas followed Leuctra with something even more devastating. He invaded the Peloponnese, marched to the very edges of Sparta, and for the first time in recorded history, a foreign army stood in the Eurotas Valley. Sparta had no walls. It had always relied on its soldiers. Now its soldiers lay dead at Leuctra, and a Theban army looked down from the hills. Sparta was not taken, not entirely. The Spartan women and old men and helots defended the city, but Epaminondas did something that struck at the roots of Spartan power more surely than any sack could have. He liberated Messenia. In 370 BCE, Epaminondas proclaimed the freedom of the Messenian helots and founded a new city for them, Messene, strongly fortified on the slopes of Mount Ithome. The Messenian exiles scattered across the Greek world, descendants of those who had fled generations earlier, were invited to return. A new Messenian state was proclaimed. With a stroke, Sparta lost approximately half its agricultural base and the helot labor that sustained the entire citizen system. The economic foundation of the Spartan way of life had been pulled away. From this moment, Sparta was in permanent, irreversible decline. Chapter 12: The Long Decline. The 4th century BCE saw Sparta struggling to maintain relevance in a Greek world that had moved beyond it. The citizen population continued to shrink through battle casualties, through the oliganthropia that ancient writers noted with concern, through the concentration of land in fewer and fewer hands as wealthy families bought out impoverished ones, whose members could no longer afford the mess contributions that citizen status required. Spartan kings and reformers attempted to address these problems. King Agis IV in the early 3rd century BCE proposed radical reforms, redistribution of land, cancellation of debts, expansion of the citizen body. His proposals threatened the established interests of wealthy Spartan families, and he was killed for his pains, executed by the ephors in 241 BCE, a shocking fate for a king. Cleomenes III, a generation later, managed to implement some of the reforms Agis had died for. He abolished the ephorate, redistributed land, enrolled Perioc and freed Helots as new citizens, and for a brief period gave Sparta renewed military vigor. He won victories over the Achaean League, the dominant power in the Peloponnese during the Hellenistic period. But Macedonian power, the power of Philip II and then Alexander the Great, overshadowed all the Greek states. And Cleomenes was eventually defeated by the combined forces of the Achaean League and Macedon at the Battle of Silesia in 222 BCE. He fled to Egypt and died there. The period that followed was one of social chaos in Sparta. A violent ruler named Nabis, who called himself king though his legitimacy was disputed, attempted another round of radical reform, freeing Helots, redistributing land, building a genuinely broader citizen body. He was assassinated in 192 BCE. Rome was now the power that mattered. Roman armies moved through Greece, and the Greek city-states, including Sparta, became clients, then subjects of Rome. Sparta retained a degree of formal independence and autonomy for some time, but its decisions were increasingly made in the shadow of Roman power. Paradoxically, Roman rule brought Sparta a kind of revival, not of real power, but of reputation. The Romans were fascinated by Sparta, admiring its military tradition and its constitution as exemplars of virtues they associated with their own idealized past. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to Sparta to observe the festivals. The Spartans, shrewd about their place in the New World, commercialized their own customs. The brutal flogging contests, the austere messes, the physical training, all became spectacles for wealthy Roman tourists. Spartans submitted to flogging in front of audiences at the altar of Artemis Orthia, competing to see who could endure the most without crying out, as Romans watched from specially constructed theaters. This ritual, ancient in origin, had been transformed into a performance for outsiders, a kind of living museum of Spartan virtue that substituted for the real thing. It is one of the more melancholy images in the long story of Spartan decline, the inheritors of Leonidas' tradition bleeding for the entertainment of Roman sightseers. The final extinguishing of Sparta as a meaningful political entity came gradually. The city survived into the Byzantine period, shrunken and provincial. The great landmarks of the classical city, the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, the tombs of the kings, the temple of Athena Chalkioikos on the Acropolis remained visible for centuries. Travelers in the Roman period could still visit them. What the city could not preserve was the spirit that had made it extraordinary. That spirit, whatever its moral complications, whatever the suffering it rested on, had depended on a specific set of conditions: a large helot labor force, a stable citizen body willing to accept iron discipline, a geographic isolation that limited outside influence, and a political culture that prized stability above all things. When those conditions dissolved, Sparta dissolved with them. Chapter 13. The Spartan Legacy. Sparta has never left us. 25 centuries after Leonidas died in the pass at Thermopylae, his name and his city continue to inspire, to trouble, and to fascinate. The image of Sparta has been used by almost every political tradition and almost every ideological current of the modern era, which is a sure sign that it contains something genuinely complex and genuinely powerful. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers admired what they took to be Sparta's egalitarianism, its rejection of luxury and private wealth, its subordination of individual interest to collective good. Jean-Jacques Rousseau found in Sparta a model of civic virtue, uncorrupted by commerce and civilization. The leaders of the French Revolution invoked Spartan imagery as they sought to create a new republic of citizens. 19th century European nationalists and militarists found in Sparta a different set of virtues: racial purity, military discipline, the subordination of the individual to the state, the elimination of the weak. This darker appropriation of Sparta reached its most extreme and deadly form in the ideology of the 20th century's totalitarian movements, which found in Sparta a kind of precursor to their own programs of social engineering and military education. At the same time, Sparta's military reputation has made it an enduring reference point in military history and theory. The tactics of Thermopylae, the use of terrain to nullify numerical advantage, the value of discipline and unit cohesion, the possibility of a small force holding against a large one, have been studied by soldiers in every subsequent age. Military academies have incorporated Spartan principles into their curricula. Special forces units around the world have borrowed Spartan terminology and imagery. The word Spartan itself, in English and other languages, has come to mean rigorously austere, stripped of comfort, enduring. The story of the 300 at Thermopylae has become one of the most retold stories in Western culture. Ancient Greek historians told it. Roman historians repeated and amplified it. Medieval chroniclers knew it. Enlightenment philosophers cited it. Victorian poets versified it. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it was turned into graphic novels, films, television series, video games, and countless other popular cultural forms. Each retelling reflects the values and anxieties of its own age more than it reflects the historical reality of 480 BCE. But each retelling also keeps alive something real: the memory of an extraordinary moment when a small number of men chose to stand against an overwhelming power and did not move. Scholarship has complicated the simple heroic picture in important ways. The Spartan system rested on the systematic exploitation and terrorizing of the Helots, a fact that ancient admirers sometimes acknowledged and more often glossed over, and that modern scholarship has properly foregrounded. Sparta produced almost no philosophy, almost no science, almost no literature, almost no art. The things we associate with the flowering of Greek civilization were almost entirely the products of other city-states, above all Athens. The Spartan system was extraordinarily efficient at producing one thing, soldiers, and extraordinarily inefficient at producing most of the others. The Helot question is perhaps the most important corrective to Spartan romanticism. Every Spartan soldier who stood at Thermopylae was supported by Helot labor. Every year of Spartan military training was made possible by the surplus extracted from enslaved Messenian farmers. The courage of the 300 cannot be separated from the system that produced them, and that system was built on the backs of people who had no say in it and no way out of it. To admire Sparta without acknowledging the Helots is to admire a building without seeing its foundations. And yet, and this is what makes Sparta genuinely difficult rather than simply evil, the Spartan system also produced something that cannot be entirely dismissed. The communal values of the agoge, solidarity, endurance, the rejection of personal luxury, the willingness to subordinate self-interest to collective good, are not without their appeal. The Spartan insistence that citizenship entailed real obligations, not just rights, that the community's survival mattered more than any individual's comfort, speaks to something real in human social life. The problem was not the values themselves, but the narrowness of who was included in the community whose good was being served. Modern thinkers who engage seriously with Sparta come away with a complicated response: admiration for the courage and the communal commitment, horror at the helotry and the infanticide, fascination with the women's unusual freedom, unease at the total subordination of individual life to state purposes. Sparta does not resolve neatly into a simple moral lesson. It resists easy judgment. That is part of why it continues to haunt us. Chapter 14. Gods Festivals, and the Spartan sacred world. Sparta was a deeply religious society, as all ancient Greek societies were, but its religious life had distinctive features that set it apart from the rest of the Greek world. The most important deity in the Spartan religious world was not Ares, the god of war, as one might expect, but Apollo. The Spartan connection to Apollo ran deep and was expressed in multiple ways. Sparta was a key state in the Amphictyonic League, the religious organization that supervised the Delphic Oracle, Apollo's most important sanctuary in Greece. Spartan decisions on major matters, foreign policy, constitutional change, declarations of war, were regularly submitted to Delphi for divine sanction. The Spartan constitution itself was said to have been endorsed by the oracle. Lycurgus, according to tradition, had received divine approval from Delphi before implementing his reforms. The festival of the Carnia, held in honor of Apollo each summer, was so sacred to Sparta that it regularly prevented military action during its observance. It was the Carnia that had prevented the Spartan army from reaching Marathon in time for the battle in 490 BCE, and the same festival that constrained the force sent to Thermopylae in 480 BCE. The Spartans took this restriction seriously, even when it cost them militarily, a remarkable testimony to the genuine force of their religious commitments. The Hyacinthia was another major Apollo festival, celebrated over 3 days at Amyclae, the site of a famous cult of Apollo and of the tomb of the hero Hyacinthos. The festival moved through phases of mourning for Hyacinthos, a beautiful youth killed accidentally by Apollo, and then celebration of Apollo's gifts. It was one of the most important occasions in the Spartan religious calendar, attended by Perioik and visitors as well as citizens. Artemis Orthia had her sanctuary on the banks of the Eurotas, and her cult was one of the most ancient in Sparta. It was at her altar that the flogging contests were held, and at her sanctuary that excavations have produced some of the most important archaeological evidence for early Spartan culture. Thousands of small votive objects, lead figurines, ivory carvings, bone plaques, bronze animals, deposited by worshippers over centuries, reflecting a religious community that was once far more artistically engaged than its later self-image suggested. Helen of Troy held an unusual place in Spartan religion. She was worshipped as a goddess or semi-divine figure at a sanctuary near Therapne, the site of the Bronze Age palace. Her husband Menelaus was similarly honored nearby. The Spartans thus maintained, in religious form, the connection to the heroic past that the literary tradition had established. Visitors to Sparta in the classical and Hellenistic periods could see these sanctuaries and could be told stories connecting the great Spartan families to the heroes of the Trojan War. The dead were remembered through ritual at the tombs of the two royal families and at the graves of heroes. The Spartans brought the bones of the hero Orestes from Tegea to Sparta in the 6th century BCE, following an oracular instruction to ensure that divine power was on their side. The physical presence of heroic remains was believed to convey protection and strength. This practice was not unique to Sparta, but the Spartans pursued it with particular devotion. Religious conservatism was itself a Spartan value. The same impulse that resisted political change also resisted religious innovation. Sparta's cults were ancient and maintained ancient forms. When the rest of the Greek world was importing new cults, new deities, new religious ideas from the East and from Egypt, as became common in the Hellenistic period, Sparta was slower to adopt these novelties. The religious world of classical Sparta was, in this sense, continuous with the religious world of archaic Sparta in a way that was unusual. Chapter 15. Spartan Art, Music, and Poetry. The persistent image of Sparta as a city without culture, a place of warriors and nothing more, does a serious injustice to the historical reality, particularly of the archaic period. In the 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Sparta was one of the most culturally productive cities in Greece. Laconian pottery was exported across the Mediterranean world, found in archaeological sites from Spain to the Black Sea coast. It was decorated with lively, assured paintings in a black figure style, scenes of mythological narrative, processions, athletic contests, animals, that compare favorably with contemporary pottery from other Corinth and Athens. The potters who made it achieved real artistic distinction. Spartan bronzework was among the finest in Greece. The bronze figurines produced in Laconian workshops, warriors, horses, athletes, animals show technical mastery and genuine aesthetic sensibility. Laconian bronze mirrors were luxury items sought by wealthy customers throughout the Greek world. The bronze-working tradition of Sparta was maintained by periodic craftsmen, but the designs and the market were Spartan. Music was central to Spartan life in ways that might surprise those who know only the barracks image. Choral singing was a major social institution in Sparta, with groups of men, women, and young people performing elaborate choral compositions at festivals and religious occasions. The great lyric poet Alcman worked in Sparta in the 7th century BCE, composing elaborate choral songs, Parthenia, maiden songs, for performance by choirs of Spartan girls. These poems, fragments of which survive, are among the most beautiful products of Greek lyric poetry. They suggest a society of genuine aesthetic sophistication, capable of creating and appreciating complex, subtle artistic work. Terpander, another early Greek musician, was associated with Sparta and credited with important innovations in the development of the lyre and musical modes. The tradition of foreign musicians visiting Sparta and contributing to its cultural life suggests that in the archaic period Sparta was a welcoming destination for artistic talent, not a Philistine rejection of culture. The transformation came gradually, and its causes are still debated. The crisis of the Messenian Wars, the demands of the Agoge, the increasing militarization of Spartan society, all of these contributed to narrowing the cultural world that early Sparta had inhabited. By the 5th century BCE, the rich pottery tradition had ceased. The commissioning of elaborate choral poetry had faded. The cultural energy that had once found expression in art and music was increasingly directed toward military excellence alone. But the music never entirely disappeared. The Spartans continued to march into battle to the sound of pipes, the aulos, a double-reed instrument something like an oboe which set the rhythm for their advance. They continued to sing choral hymns at their festivals. The musical strand in Spartan culture persisted, transformed and reduced but never extinguished. Poetry also persisted in a specifically Spartan form, the tradition of war songs and exhortatory verse. The poems of Tyrtaeus, composed during the Second Messenian War, were memorized and sung by Spartan soldiers for generations afterward. They were a form of communal self-understanding, expressing and reinforcing the values the Spartan community held most dear. Whatever the culture had lost in aesthetic range, it maintained in this more functional form. Chapter 16. The Spartan Soldier in Battle. Let us go at last to the battlefield. Let us stand with the Spartan soldier on the edge of a Bronze Age engagement and try to understand what he was, what he carried, what he feared, and what he did. The Spartan warrior of the classical period was a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, armored and equipped to fight in the close-order formation called the phalanx. His equipment was formidable. He carried a large round shield, the hoplon or aspes, about a meter in diameter, made of wood faced with bronze, gripped by a central armband and a hand grip at the rim. The shield was heavy, perhaps 7 kilograms, and shaped so that it protected not only its own bearer, but overlapped slightly with the shield of the man to his left. The Spartan's right side was thus protected by his own shield, and his left side by his neighbor's. The formation's strength came from collective discipline. So long as every man held his position, the line was nearly impenetrable. His primary weapon was the doro, a thrusting spear roughly 2 to 2.5 meters long, tipped with a leaf-shaped bronze blade. He also carried a short sword, the xiphos, for close fighting when the spear was broken or dropped. His head was protected by a bronze Corinthian helmet, which in its early form covered the entire face except for narrow slits for the eyes and mouth, giving the wearer an almost inhuman, mask-like appearance. Later styles, Chalcidian, Attic, left more of the face exposed, allowing better vision and hearing. His body was protected by a bronze cuirass in the early period, later often replaced by a linothorax, a corselet made of layers of linen glued together, lighter and more flexible than bronze, but still offering substantial protection. Greaves of bronze protected his shins. Altogether, the equipment weighed perhaps 20 to 30 kilograms, and the man inside it was expected to march long distances and then fight for extended periods. The phalanx formation was typically 8 ranks deep, though it could be deeper or shallower depending on tactical circumstances. Epaminondas' innovation at Leuctra was to make his best troops 50 ranks deep on one wing, concentrating overwhelming force against a single point. The Spartan tradition had favored shallower formations of superior individual quality. The collision of 2 phalanxes was one of the most violent and chaotic events in ancient warfare. The 2 lines would advance toward each other, sometimes at a run, sometimes at a deliberate walk, and slam together with a crash of shields and spears. The front ranks would stab over and under shields with their spears, trying to kill or wound opponents, while the ranks behind pushed forward, literally pushing, pressing their shields into the backs of the men in front to give them momentum. This pushing, the athismos, was both a literal physical force and a moral force. The side that believed it would win pressed harder, and pressing harder helped make it win. Spartan discipline in this chaos was legendary. The Agoge had spent years preparing men for exactly this moment. The noise, the blood, the screaming of the wounded, the sight of companions falling, the pressure of men behind pushing forward. Spartans were trained to maintain their position in the line no matter what happened, to trust their training, to act not from individual initiative but from collective discipline. This collective confidence, the certainty that every man in the line would hold, was itself a military advantage, because it allowed the Spartan phalanx to maintain cohesion through shocks that would break other formations. The Spartan advance into battle was famous for its deliberateness. Ancient sources describe Spartan armies approaching at a measured pace to the sound of pipes, moving slowly and steadily, while other armies were running or advancing in disorder. This was not timidity, it was control. A formation that arrives at impact in good order has a massive advantage over one that has become disordered by its own enthusiasm. The scarlet cloaks of the Spartan warriors were as carefully chosen as everything else in the system. Red was the color least associated with the appearance of blood, a practical consideration in an era before camouflage. But the uniform color also created a visual solidarity, a massed red front that was itself intimidating, that announced to opponents, "We are one. We are Sparta. We do not hesitate." After a Spartan victory, the army built a trophy, a wooden post hung with captured armor, and then withdrew, neither plundering nor mutilating the enemy dead. The enemy would be allowed to collect their dead under a truce. This practice was itself a form of dominance. The Spartans were so confident in their superiority that they felt no need to add humiliation to defeat. Return from battle presented its own tests. A Spartan soldier who had lost his shield was considered to have committed the gravest possible military disgrace. Shields were the collective instruments of the phalanx, and throwing one away to run faster in retreat endangered the whole line. A man who came home without his shield faced social death, ridicule, exclusion, the loss of status. The injunction to come back with your shield or on it, carried back as a dead hero, was not merely a romantic expression. It was a practical statement of the values the Agoge had instilled. Epilogue: the river still flows. We have traveled far tonight, from the prehistoric caves of the Tegidos foothills to the polished marble of the Roman tourist circuit, From the obscure tribal conflicts of the early Iron Age to the world historical clash of Greeks and Persians. From the brutal clarity of the Agoge to the complicated freedom of Spartan women. From the fields where Messenian helots bent over their harvest to the bronze clash of shields at Thermopylae, at Plataea, at Leuctra. The Eurotas still flows through its valley. The Tegidos mountains still rise to the west, snow-capped in winter, golden-brown in summer. The modern city of Sparta, Spartian Greek, sits on the plain, a 19th century town built when the Greek nation-state sought to honor its ancient past. There are ruins visible, fragments of the theater, the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia behind its later Roman theater, the Acropolis Hill with its scattered remains of Byzantine walls built from ancient stones. A museum holds the votives found at the sanctuary, the lead figurines, the bronze plaques, the evidence of a civilization that was once more than its legend. Leonidas stands in bronze on the main street, his shield raised, his face concealed behind the bronze mask of his helmet. The inscription on the base says simply, Malan Labe, come and take them. The words he reportedly said when the Persians demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons at Thermopylae. Whether he actually said them, no one knows. What is certain is that the words have lasted longer than the man, longer than the city, longer than the civilization, carried forward by every generation that has found in them something essential about human defiance, human dignity, the choice to stand when everything says to run. Sparta was not good by modern moral standards. It was not a democracy. It was not a place of individual freedom. It was built on the suffering of an enslaved people and maintained through systematic violence. Its values were narrow, its culture eventually barren, its political system too rigid to adapt to a changing world. And yet, the images persist. The red cloaks, the bronze shield, the narrow pass, the epitaph on the stone. These are not just military memories. They are images of a human possibility, the possibility of a community so committed to a shared purpose that individual members will choose death before dishonor, will stand when they know they will not survive, will hold the line so that something behind them, some future, some community, some fragile idea, has a chance. That possibility, with all its costs, is what Sparta gave to history. And it is what history, through all the centuries of retelling, cannot quite bring itself to forget. The river still flows, the mountains still rise, sleep now. This has been the complete history of Sparta before bed. Sources and further reading. For listeners and readers who wish to explore further, the following ancient sources are invaluable. Herodotus, the Histories, particularly books 5 through 9, for the Persian Wars and Sparta's role in them. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, for the great conflict between Sparta and Athens. Xenophon, A History of My Times, Hellenica, and the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, for 4th century Sparta from a writer who admired the Spartans deeply. Plutarch Lives, particularly the lives of Lycurgus, Solon, Themistocles, Aristides, Cimon, Pericles, Lysander, Agesilaus, Agis, Cleomenes, and others. Among modern scholarly works, Paul Cartledge's Sparta and Laconia, and the Spartans offer authoritative, readable accounts. Anton Powell's edited volume, A Companion to Sparta, provides detailed scholarly treatment of every aspect of Spartan society. Stephen Hodkinson's Property and Wealth in Classical Sparta addresses the economic dimensions of Spartan society with rigor. Nigel Kennell's The Gymnasium of Virtue examines the agoge. Victor Davis Hanson's The Western Way of War explores Greek hoplite warfare in illuminating detail. For the Helot perspective, essential and often neglected, Nino Laraghi and Susan Alcock's edited volume Helots and Their Masters in Laconia and Messenia is indispensable. The story of Sparta is inexhaustible. May your sleep be deep, your dreams brave, and your morning full of the quiet knowledge that you have walked, at least in imagination, through one of the most extraordinary human experiments in all of recorded history. Good night.